Well, the value of the rand, the currency in your pocket, has taken another hammering again over the last 24 hours. The rand trading at one point at 19 rand 43 cents to the dollar this morning. Been trending down for the last month or so. Like everything else, you can probably blame load shedding for it, but there are other important factors as well. Thalia Petousis is a portfolio manager at Allan. Thalia, good afternoon to you. Why is the rand so low against the dollar at the moment?
Yeah, so if one looks very recently at the news flow just over the last 2 weeks, I mean, obviously it's been quite negative. So there were allegations that we'd sold arms to Russia. Obviously, the market's concerned about how that's going to affect our trade with the US and the AGOA trade pact and so on. And then very recently, as of this morning, Eskom's come out, guiding us to the fact that even though it's not their base case, we may reach stage 8 load shedding in winter, which essentially is 16 hours of outages in a 32-hour cycle. But more broadly, if one thinks about the weakness in the rand over, let's say, the last year or so, I mean, if you cast your mind back to March of 22, when we were about 14 rand 50 to the dollar, we were also having this really big export boom. And that's obviously very rand supportive, because then, the exporters, for example, the miners, will repatriate their export profits and in other words, sell dollars, which they're earning back into rands. And that wasn't really a volume story. So, for example, coal volumes, along the coal line were hitting kind of their lowest level since 93 last year, but it was really a pricing story. So we saw very elevated prices in a range of commodities like rhodium, platinum, coal, and that was really keeping the export story on the road. But then as of December 22, we've swung back into, a current account deficit, which means we are importing more goods than we are exporting. And that's obviously also, that weighs heavy on the rand, because, importers are predominantly, they're buying dollars, they're selling rands, this rand selling pressure. And then alongside, the negative news flow of the last, few weeks, and in particular the last, week and a half or so, foreigners then will also come through and start to sell rand assets like government bonds, and then that adds to that selling pressure on the rand.
It seems the main problem is that the rest of the world just don't believe we'll get our act together. Would that be right? I mean, load shedding shows we're not getting our act together.
Yeah, and I think people are feeling that way. I think, a lot of the targets that Eskom has put out. So, for example, at one point they said, by March of this year we would achieve 60% energy availability factor. They missed that target. We were at 56%. We've now fallen even further to 52%. So what that means is that, if the actual installed capacity on the grid is about 48 gigawatts, they're only able to supply 52% of that, and then demand is then in excess of supply, and that leads to load shedding. So I think there's a lot of disillusionment around the missed targets. There are a lot of unknowns going into winters, and I think foreign investors are quite cautious. I think they're feeling quite negative. Not only on shares, because obviously this is impacting, companies' profits, it's sort of destroying their margins, but also in terms of South African bonds, all of this means that corporate income tax collection and maybe personal income tax collection is likely to be quite a bit lower this year, and then that will bleed into government revenues being lowered and potentially force them to issue more debt than what they would have expected to.
There are a couple of things going on in the world right now. One of them is the dollar is very strong, right, which is quite strange because Joe Biden's just had to cut short a visit to Asia to stop his country falling off a fiscal cliff. I don't want to explain what a fiscal cliff is, because you can explain it to me 3 times, I still won't get it. The problem is that the dollar is still very strong. How long do we expect it to be strong for?
So, the dollar's been strong for a while, and I think, it's gone against, I guess, certainly the expectations of some analysts. I guess you can say that, okay, the US has its problems. They've issued a huge amount of debt. US government debt to GDP is about 125%. That's a huge number. And there are no imminent plans to rein in spending. So even if you look at the US Debt Management Office's own projections for spending in the coming years and for their fiscal deficit, it's likely to remain quite elevated. They've got a lot of spending pressures coming through in healthcare, the aging of the baby boomers, which is that, huge generation they have, likely to put spending pressures there. But, I mean, really, if you look elsewhere in the world, it's not clear that anyone else is getting very much else right. So, I mean, if you look at euro-dollar, I mean, last year, Europe came very close to their own energy crisis. They've been struggling with their own structural shortage of energy. They're trying to transition away from traditional energy in a big hurry, or at least they have been. And so they've been facing their own energy shortages. So I think some of it is that. And then also clear yet that the US is going to enter a recession. So the labor market is still quite strong. US consumer spending is still quite high. Their unemployment rate is kind of close to record lows.
There's a lot going on in the US. You talk about other countries, other parts of the world not getting their act together either. Emerging markets, and we're technically in this basket of emerging markets. I mean, billions of dollars, I think, flowed out of China during the pandemic. Western executives left. Turkey's inflation's been between 50 at 1.80%. Brazil has huge political problems and divisions. I don't know any Western investor who's putting money into Russia right now. Are our problems worse than the problems in the countries that we used to compare ourselves to?
So, I mean, if one thinks about emerging and frontier markets, I mean, certainly, I mean, if you look just across the African continent, I mean, Ghana has had effectively a soft default on their local currency bonds this year. Zambia defaulted on their debt in 2020. In Argentina, they have inflation of 100% year on year. Versus that, our very muted 7% year on year seems like a bit of a joke. But the rand is still, regardless, it sold off about 12% this year. And I think one of the only major emerging markets to have sold off in excess of that was, in fact, Argentina. So we're definitely taking a beating. I do also think, the rand is an incredibly liquid currency, so it's a very easy one for foreigners to sell. In a lot of emerging markets, or even in frontier markets or across Africa, when these issues come about, they don't necessarily have liquid currencies that can really be a release valve for all of these pressures. Foreigners are not going to come through and start selling the Ghanaian cedi en masse. It barely trades. So I do think also sometimes we take an extra beating for our liquidity.
Too much of the carry trade. In a way, the risk for us is a sort of downward spiral, right? So just as an example, at the moment, stage 8 load shedding on the horizon, you need diesel to run a business. The rand tanks because we have no power. The price of diesel goes up, which makes it expensive to run your business, which means that our economy slows, which means that the rand tanks. That's the spiral we've got to get out of, isn't it?
Yeah, that is the spiral. I think if one takes sort of a longer-term outlook, looking out beyond winter, and again, Eskom's given this update today, and they have said, the winter outlook is incredibly tight. Any significant outage is going to have a knock-on effect, and even in their base case and worst case, scenarios, they haven't factored in, industrial action like a strike, or I guess the collapse of another major piece of infrastructure, like for example, when that Kusile chimney collapsed last year in October, that contributed 2 stages to load shedding. But if you take a sort of 2 to 3 year outlook, it does feel as though some progress is being made in terms of reform here. I'm referring to things like the renewable energy independent power producer projects, the solar rooftop initiative, the opportunity for municipalities to procure their own power, hopefully the RMIPP and that car power ship, if they can overcome those environmental concerns, and then things like embedded generation. So, we're not there yet, but in terms of friendly government reform, I think we're moving in the right direction. Obviously, these solutions should have come into play a long time ago, and we've only really started to grasp for them at the 11th hour. But certainly, we're hopefully, this year winter going to be near the worst of it.
Thalia Petousis, thank you. Portfolio manager at Allan. Really do appreciate the time. Scary times, isn't it? Well,